let's go over these topics of chapter 13. Again, with this chapter, I'm only going to cover some of the main things and hormones that we hear about frequently in the course. There's a lot more in your textbook, and there's more in the homework, but really, what do you need to know? Just really make sure you look over the study guide for the test. Because the endocrine system is there's a lot of hormones. So we're gonna, the point here is I'm introducing you to some of the key processes that hormones use and some of the main ones that we talk about in this course. All right, so let's get going here. All right, so endocrine glands. So endocrine means endo within, right? So what's happening here is that the hormones are being secreted into the blood. They're not being secreted exocrine fashion, meaning out onto the surface, liquid, or into lumens like sweat or digestive juices, which we'll talk about later. So this is something that's going, mostly for this course, we think about them going into the blood. So hormones, basically what's happening with these in the endocrine system is that these hormones are being exposed to every cell in the body, and it's only those cells that have receptors for that particular hormone that actually respond to it. But all the cells are exposed to the hormone. So that's kind of the important thing here. So what are they? Well, they're chemical messengers. They're circulating in the bloodstream, and they're only acting on those specific cells, the target cells that have the appropriate receptor, all right? Something that you want to keep in mind is that there are hormones that react in, or act, not react, act in a, what we call a paracrine fashion, meaning very locally, so they don't actually have to go into the bloodstream, but they're going into the tissue. They're not going into a lumen or on a surface. All right, and then autocrine, sometimes cells stimulate themselves this way, and cancer cells do this a lot, but there's an autocrine system, meaning that the cell self-stimulates, all right? But for what we're talking about the traditional way of thinking about these messenger systems or chemical messengers that go out into the blood. And there are a whole slew of glands that we can think about here, and we're gonna go through some of the main ones. And again, I'm not going to go into all of the great details. I'm not going to go into good things and bad things, except for when we're talking about diabetes. I'll talk a little bit about that. But there's so much to talk about. There's so many endocrine disorders out there. And again, I could talk about this for weeks. But the point in this course is to give you some exposure to, and a basic understanding of these, all right? So if you look at these glands, you might see something like, wait a minute, the heart is not a gland. But the heart, even though it has a function that we've already talked about, it also secretes a hormone. We don't talk about it too much in this course. I will mention it later, but it has to do with your urinary system, atrial natriuretic hormone. We'll talk about it later. You see the stomach, we'll talk about this one. The stomach is also going to release a hormone in addition to digesting your food. So we'll talk about these things later on as well. You know, as well as here in the intestines. We'll talk about that later. And what goes on in the ovaries and the testes, we'll talk about those later anyways. So we're going to really just get you a grounding here. And then some glands, like the pancreas, it's an exocrine and an endocrine gland. And we'll talk about that, the exocrine functions, again, when we do digestion, because it's really important there. And we also have stuff in lab on that, okay? But the one thing, and even my daughter right now is in grade 7, they were looking at, well, how do different organ systems cooperate? And she was even learning that the endocrine and the nervous system cooperate in order to maintain, here's our big word, homeostasis, all right? So they're similar and different. They're having responses in the body, but the responses are sort of different and sort of similar. So hormones sort of are like neurotransmitters because they bind to a receptor and they cause a response, okay? But the difference is here is that the endocrine system, the hormones, like I said, have access to every cell in the body, whereas neurotransmitters act locally to the neighboring cell. the hormone acts only on specific target cells, whereas a neurotransmitter is acting locally on those neurons there. So in that way, they're sort of similar. So like I said, only specific cells have the receptors for those particular hormones. But in contrast to the nervous system, the endocrine system reacts slower, but is much more longer lasting than would be the response from the nervous system. So in that way, they complement each other. And in some places, they actually interact directly. And we're going to sort of talk about one of those cases right now. There's another one that's in your book that I just don't have time to talk about it, but I might mention it later on. But here, we're going to look mostly at the hypothalamus, and that's where we're going to see this direct interaction. All right. So there are two classic mechanisms or two classic types of hormones. There are some other little ones. We'll mention one today, or I will mention one in the video. I did it in the same day in class. So the steroid hormones, remember steroids, going back to our macromolecules, remember steroids are lipids. And that means that they can cross the cell membrane. So they don't need a receptor on the cell surface. They can just go right through the cell membrane. And they bind to receptors that are actually inside the cell, sometimes right in the nucleus. So for example, here, this hormone receptor in this example is going to bind to the steroid hormone. It then has a way of activating a gene in the DNA, and that makes then a protein, okay? So these ones, they can act directly on the genetics and cause a local response in that cell that has the receptor, but it's not on the cell surface. Now, a lot of the other proteins, when we say non-steroid hormones, are what did I just say? A lot of the other hormones, when we say non-steroid hormones, are proteins. That's what I meant to say. And as you know, proteins don't readily cross the cell membrane. So for these types of hormones, they rely on a receptor that is on the cell surface. Now, there's a variety of these types of receptors, because what needs to happen is that when that hormone binds to its cell surface receptor, it has to cause some sort of a change to then mitigate some sort of a change on the inside of the cell to then cause the reaction to the hormone, okay? So some of these receptors have an enzyme component to them. So remember, enzymes cause a reaction, so they do some chemistry on the inside of the cell that makes something new, right? Because enzymes are catalysts for some sort of reaction, right? And some of them, they're direct enzymes. Sometimes they're called G protein coupled receptors. Those are a little different. But for this class, we're just going to look at one type. And the reason we mentioned this one is because this was the first one that was discovered. What's happening here is that this receptor, all right, and actually the hormone that we were talking about here is one that's, I don't mention too much, but it's actually a neurotransmitter that acts as a hormone, adrenaline or epinephrine. And this is one of our linkages between the nervous system and the endocrine system. But it was, since it's such an important aspect of our fight or flight response, it was studied in great detail, and it was determined that when this hormone / neurotransmitter binds to its receptor, it activates an enzyme on the inside called cyclic AMP. Adenylate cyclase is the name of the enzyme, and the product of that is something called cyclic AMP. So the enzyme takes ATP, twists it around a little bit to make it into a circle, and loses 2 phosphates, and we call that cyclic AMP, and this is called a second messenger. So the first messenger is considered the hormone itself, and when it binds to its receptor, the receptor then makes a second messenger, right? So there's a whole bunch of these types of receptors. In this example here, the enzyme on it is called adenylate cyclase, and it makes a second messenger called cyclic AMP. But then in class, I said to you, do you think it only makes one molecule of cyclic AMP? No, absolutely not. This enzyme is going to make thousands of these, right? So you could say that with one receptor, you could have 1,000 times amplification of the signal from one hormone molecule, all right? And this, what then happens is that it activates what we say a cascade of enzymes. You think about it as a waterfall, right? So the first one starts, and then the next one starts, and then the next one starts. When I was really young, there was a commercial on TV, and was something about it. It was for a hair product, and it was some woman. She says, "Well, I tried this, and then I told 2 friends, and then each of those 2 friends tells 2 more friends, and then those 2 friends tell 2 more friends, and you can understand what's happening here. You get an augmentation of the people buying that product. So here, you're not just making 2 friends, you're making 1,000 friends, and then those 1,000 friends will work with the second enzyme to make a third messenger, and it's going up in incredible amounts. You're really amplifying the signal, and you could only maybe have 1 or 2 of these receptors react to these hormones. So that the power of these non-steroid hormones are the receptors, and you don't really need much of them to have a huge response. All right, so that's what you should get out of this. What do you need to know? Well, you need to know this example that cyclic AMP is the second messenger, and the hormone that is binding to the receptor is the first messenger. And I'm not sure if this is in the study guide, but the enzyme is the adenylate cyclase. All right. So then you can see there's 2 different ways here. So with the steroid hormones, they can go right into the cell and just bind directly, but you need a lot more of them to have a bigger effect. Whereas here, you need very little hormone to have a huge effect. Okay. Now, the other thing that I want you to think about in terms of your steroid hormones, and this is why people who take steroids don't really realize they're sort of hurting themselves, but they're all based on cholesterol, right? So we looked at this way back at the beginning of the course when we looked at our molecules, and their lipids, they're based on cholesterol. And what I want you to see is that there's just little changes that happen. So here you can see cholesterol looks like this, but then estrogen, which is a steroid hormone we'll talk about later, you still have that basic shape, but these functional groups or these side chains are reduced down to this. Versus cortisol, which is another hormone we don't talk about, but that's the stress hormone. You might hear about that in the media, that cortisol is bad for you. I mean, you need it for certain things, but too much of a good thing is a bad thing, right? You see how it looks a little bit different than estrogen. And then here you have aldosterone, which is one that controls kidneys, which we'll mention later. Again, right? So there's these little functional groups. So that's one thing I want you to notice here. So these steroid hormones are based on the same root, but some hormones are intermediates for others. And this is going to come important when we talk about reproductive system, okay? So you all know that testosterone is the bunny ear quotes, the male hormone, and that estrogen, again, bunny ear quotes, is the female hormone. But notice that in order to get estrogen, you've got to have testosterone or an androgen, okay? So women do have testosterone, and they have androgens, right? But they don't have testes. We'll talk about that later, where women get their testosterone from. Conversely, men need estrogen. They don't need it in the same way. Well, they do, but not the way you would think about. But estrogen does other things in men that is needed. So men also do make estrogen, but they don't have ovaries. So we'll talk about all of these things, all right? If we're lucky, we'll see how far we go. But I do want you to see that. Oh, but this is here's where it comes in. I mean, the other female bunny ear quotes again here at my desk is progesterone, right? Hello guys. Notice you need to have progesterone in order to get your testosterone. Yeah. So this is sort of the point of this slide, to let you see that there is this relationship. Do I expect you to memorize it? No, absolutely not. But I just want you to have an appreciation for what's happening, okay? Now, the classic way in which hormones work is through negative feedback. And we talked about that before. So the point here is just to remind you this, right? So if you have a lowering or a raising of your set point, what's going to happen is that the body is going to stimulate an endocrine gland to mitigate a response on a target tissue to reverse that change and get you back to a set point. Okay, so I talked about this before, but I didn't really talk about how it worked, right? We mentioned a little bit about, oh, that's distracting. We mentioned a little bit about the fact that we need it for bone develop, turnover, okay? But let me just turn that off, that's annoying.
Call from Northwell. Call from Northwest.
Sorry, I get all kinds of calls during the day. So we talked about that in terms of bone turnover, but we didn't really talk about it in terms of what exactly was happening and how those hormones were working. And you're going to see, I'm going to mention it again, I'm going to go over it, but we're also going to talk about how that relates to other hormones in terms of a similar system, negative feedback, okay? But the thing to understand here is that these glands, sometimes there isn't just one hormone involved, and that's the point here. Sometimes there's up to 3 different hormones that are responsible for an effect, and they all work through negative feedback. And we'll see that a little bit when we look at the sex hormones later on in the course, all right? So you'll see that happening there. So in this case, we have gland A that is responding to some sort of an effect. It's going to be released into the bloodstream, and that's going to then affect gland B, which is going to then release hormone B. And hormone B, when it goes up, it's going to sort of turn down gland A as a negative feedback, but it's going to act on a new target organ. All right, so in this case, we have a 2-hormone system working with 2 different glands. But like I said, we're going to go up to 3 glands in this course. So when you look at this, what I want you to see is that the second or the third hormones can act as dampers for the previous hormone in the system in terms of its negative feedback. So if we're looking at something, and we're going to talk about this a bit, if we're having a hormone cascade between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and something else, you can see that the hormones will act in sequence on the different glands, and then that hormone 2 will feed back on the gland for hormone 1, and that hormone 3 will feed back on the glands for 2 and 3. So we call these short loop negative feedback or long loop. And then we also have ultra short loops. Sometimes this will also work, that the hormone 1 will stamp down on gland 1 as well. But the point here, again, is not to try and overwhelm you, but just understand that there's negative feedback at every level of this. And a term that I'd like you to remember is this term tropic hormone. And a tropic hormone, its job is not to cause the actual endocrine effect, but its job is to stimulate the release of another hormone, all right? So here you can see with this system, we have 2 different tropic hormones, and it's actually hormone 3, which isn't tropic, but it then causes the actual effect on the target, all right? Now, when it comes to hormones, certain hormones can have more than one target. So when we're talking about parathyroid hormone, which we mentioned earlier in the course, I mentioned that to you in terms of bone turnover, right? So if we have low calcium in the blood, there is a cell, we'll talk about where that comes from, will release parathyroid hormone, and it goes and it has 3 different effects to try and raise that blood calcium. And we talked about this earlier in the course when we did bone. We're going to break down bone and release some of that calcium into the blood. We're going to help our kidneys reabsorb calcium from the urine. And we'll also have a stimulation of the production of calcium, absorption of calcium from our intestines, right, from our diet. So there's the 3-pronged approach in terms of raising our blood calcium. So one hormone can have more than one target, and we already mentioned that in the course, all right? Sometimes there's more than one trigger for the same hormone. So we're going to talk about this briefly. Insulin, we all know about insulin because it's in the news a lot in terms of diabetes and diabetes type 2. But we have several ways or triggers for the release of that insulin. So one of them is just eating something, right? So your stomach stretches and it sends a signal to the pancreas, and we are going to have a release of insulin. Sometimes just having sugar in your gut will also do that, all right? This is a little bit of a weirder mechanism. But the other thing is raising of your blood glucose, right? So that's the other way, because that sugar that you eat is going to go into your blood, and that's also going to stimulate the pancreas. So you've got 3 different triggers for that one hormone. Now, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So this is our link, one of our links from the nervous system. So the hypothalamus is part of the brain, and the pituitary gland, which is a gland that's hanging off the brain. And the pituitary gland actually has 2 parts. has the posterior side and the anterior side. So the posterior side, if you look at this picture, so you see this hypothalamus, and you have this part here. Notice it's the same color. So the posterior pituitary is actually an extension of the hypothalamus. There's neurons that come from the hypothalamus, and their axons come down here to the bloodstream, and they're actually releasing hormones. So that's the posterior. Whereas the anterior pituitary, this part is actually glandular material. It's not neuronal. There's some parts of the hypothalamus that release hormones that travel by this really tight little bloodstream here. It's a portal system that goes directly to the anterior pituitary and nowhere else, and causes the cells in the anterior pituitary to release second hormones. So they're tropic hormones, right? So we mentioned how that works in class. So the hypothalamus we consider as the control center of the brain for our homeostasis. It links the nervous system to the endocrine system intimately. It's going to monitor and control these hormone secretions from the pituitary gland. And this is going to come back when we do the nervous system. I mean, sorry, not the nervous system, the reproductive system. So the pituitary gland, we call it the master gland. Why? Because it releases a whole bunch of hormones that you're just going to have to memorize. It releases a lot of hormones that are tropic. That then influence other hormones that then release other hormones. So this is looking at that three-step system like I was just talking about. So it secretes 8 different hormones that regulate other endocrine organs. It has 2 lobes, posterior and anterior. Like I said, the posterior part is an extension of the nervous system, and the anterior is actually gland, right? So the posterior pituitary, remember, like I said, there are cell bodies for our axons in the hypothalamus that extend right down into the posterior pituitary and release hormone. So these are actually being released from neurons, if you think about this, all right? And the 2 that I'd like you to remember, one is called antidiuretic hormone. Remember, a diuretic is something that causes you to pee, all right? So like tea or coffee. So an antidiuretic is going to try and help you conserve your water and not cause you to pee, all right? So there's some control here. The other one is a hormone we mentioned already when we talked about feedback loops. So oxytocin. Remember, that causes a positive feedback during childbirth, so causes smooth muscle contractions of the uterus. And also will cause smooth muscle contraction in mammary glands to release milk during lactation, all right? So these are the 2 I'd like you to remember here. And we've already mentioned this one, so that's not even new, all right? So antidiuretic hormone is your new one. Now the anterior pituitary releases a whole bunch of really important hormones. And I'd like you to remember them, okay? We're gonna go over what those hormones are and what they do. But they are responding now to hormones that are released by the hypothalamus, okay? So now we've got hormones released in the hypothalamus that are gonna be deposited into this tight bloodstream system called the portal system that goes only to the anterior pituitary to cause cells in the anterior pituitary to release a second hormone. Okay, so there's 5 different types of cells in the anterior pituitary that respond to hormones from the hypothalamus, and they release the hormones I'd like you to memorize. You don't need to memorize the types of cells. I just listed them here so that just for in your information. What you should concentrate on are these different hormones. So there's growth hormone, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, and adrenochromatoin releasing hormone, all right? Again, gonadotropic hormone, all right? So this is the one we're not gonna really talk about too much in this course, but these are the different ones. So let's go over what they do, all right? So ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, the one that comes from the hypothalamus is the releasing one, but you don't need to remember that. And I will always list them as the acronym or the actual hormone name. So whatever you're more comfortable learning, it's fine with me, all right? And you don't need to worry. I like remembering like the longer version because it actually tells me what it does. But anyway, so what this one is doing is going to cause the release of cortisol. And we don't really talk about it here, but it's kind of neat to know this because cortisol is, i.e. the stress hormone, again, bunny ear quotes, But you have it for a lot of different reasons. But it is partially, if with extended levels of stress, it can be damaging because it also has an effect on the immune system. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, acts on the thyroid gland and it promotes the release of the thyroid hormones. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. We'll talk about that later when we do reproductive. LH, luteinizing hormone. We'll also talk about that later when we do reproductive. But what should you know now? It has effect on the reproductive system, right? The development and functions of the ovaries and testes. And we're not really thinking about it until past age 10 to 13, puberty, although puberty does set in much, much earlier now for girls. Some girls at 8, they've already hit puberty. Prolactin, that is the one that stimulates the development of the mammary glands, but not for the release of milk, but for the production of the milk. So remember, oxytocin is the release of milk, prolactin is the production of milk, and growth hormone. This one is not a tropic hormone. This is the only one here that's not tropic. But I think what it does is pretty obvious. Growth hormone has wide spread effects on the body, affects growth, all right? Now the thyroid gland, I want to mention this because we talk about parathyroid hormone, that's a different gland, but the thyroid gland also produces a couple of really important things. So where is it? It's in your neck, and it has 2 sides, it's 2 different lobes. And what are the hormones it produces? Well, there's 2 types of cells. There's follicles. So follicle is like a ball of cells with a space in the middle where they secrete the hormone. So there's these follicular cells that secrete one hormone, and you can just learn them as T3 and T4. But what they do, so thyroxine and triiodothyronine, what they do is they regulate your metabolism. And that's kind of why I want to mention it, because there's this whole thing about being too heavy or too light. It has to do with your metabolism, and you can blame your follicular cells and your response to T3 and T4. The interesting thing here is that these hormones are iodine-based. They're not steroids and they're not proteins, which is kind of the exception to what I told you before. So these ones can easily pass through cell membranes because they're really tiny. But it has to do with why we need iodine in our diet, okay? And there's a disease called goiter that is what happens when this system isn't working properly, so if you don't have enough iodine in your diet. Now the parafollicular cells, so para means on the outside of, it's the parafollicular cells that release a hormone that we've already talked about in this class, which is calcitonin. So please, as a review, remember that hormone, ironically, only not really has very much of an effect as an adult, but what do you need to know? Calcitonin, what it will do is that when blood calcium levels are high, it's going to lower the blood levels of calcium. How does it do that? Well, it's going to decrease the rate of bone turnover by the osteoclasts and stimulate those osteoblasts to put that bone into, that calcium into the bone, or to build the bone, okay? Now, the parathyroid glands, obviously parathyroid hormone is the one I'm going to talk about. They are located, sort of embedded in the thyroid gland, all right? And it's kind of interesting because calcitonin, that was the partner hormone that I've been teaching you, even though it doesn't have a huge effect as you guys as an adult, but it comes from the thyroid, and parathyroid hormone comes from right next to it. So these ones are sort of embedded, and the number that you have embedded into your thyroid gland will vary. It's 2 or 3 of them on each lobe of the thyroid, all right? They're not really green, they're just colorized here so you can sort of see it. So this is what they really look like, right? So again, parathyroid hormone. So this is our balance, right? So remember, in my key here, green is parathyroid hormone. So this is one we just talked about it, right? So how one hormone can have more than one effect on the body. So what is it going to do? Well, it's going to stimulate it's released due to low blood calcium. It's going to raise that blood calcium. It's going to cause calcium to come out of the bone. It's going to stimulate those osteoblasts and stimulate the osteoclasts stimulate the osteoclasts, I apologize, and damp down those osteoblasts. It's going to help you absorb calcium from your diet, and it's going to help you save calcium from your urine, all right? So on the other side, when we have high blood calcium, you want to lower it. What is calcitonin going to do? It's going to do the opposite. The bones are going to take up the calcium, so you're going to stimulate the osteoblasts and dampen down the osteoclasts. You're going to absorb calcium. What am I saying? You're gonna absorb less calcium from your digestive system, and you're gonna allow for the kidneys to excrete that calcium. All right, so exactly the opposite. All right, so make sure you're straight on this. Right, so high blood calcium, calcitonin to lower that blood calcium in more than one way. Low blood calcium, you want to raise that blood calcium, and you're going to do that in more than one way, right? So make sure you see that these are sort of partner hormones, all right? Pancreas, like I said earlier, it has endocrine and exocrine functions. As an endocrine gland, which we're focusing on right now, it releases a few very important hormones directly into the blood. It's interesting that most of the gland is actually exocrine, all right? And it's only little bits of the gland that is endocrine, and those little bits where those endocrine hormones are produced or those endocrine secretions are secreted are called islets or islands within, or you could also think of them as holes within, and they're not holes, but they're holes of different type of tissue inside, embedded in the rest of the pancreas, which is made up of acini, which we'll talk about later when we talk about digestive, okay? So what do we have? Well, insulin, right? So insulin is being produced by cells called beta cells, all right? I really just want you to remember insulin. Its job is to lower blood sugar, and it promotes the uptake of sugar, glucose specifically, by the liver, the muscle, and the fat, and it promotes the conversion of glucose into glycogen, right? And as well as proteins and fat, okay? Now, it has a partner that we didn't really talk about yet, which is glucagon, and that's going to be released by the alpha cells. What this one is going to do is it's going to raise blood sugar, and it's going to cause the breakdown of glycogen to glucose in the liver, right? Then we have these other kind of curious hormones that I don't really expect you to learn, but I'm just mentioning them. So somatostatin, it sort of regulates both glucagon and insulin, sort of make sure that they're at the right levels. And then there's this other one called pancreatic polypeptide. It's released from the other cell type here called F cells. And it's supposed to let you know that you're not hungry, right? So the reason I'm mentioning it is because of the diet fad thing. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff and you read about this is where it's coming from, somatostatin and pancreatic polypeptide. But what do you need to know for this course? Obviously, glucagon and insulin, all right? Those are going to talk about it here. So after you eat a meal, your blood sugar levels are going to go up, and then therefore also your insulin levels. So insulin is going to cause you to store up that sugar, and we're really, really good at that. And if we have even more, we're going to make it into fat. So we're really good at that. Then when your blood sugar starts to drop, glucagon is going to respond by causing the breakdown of the glycogen and release that sugar back into the bloodstream, because we need to operate in a very fixed threshold of or range of sugar concentration in our blood, all right? And the reason we need to is because we need sugar to fuel ATP, right? So we need to, we need to use energy and make energy, and we do that using, we make ATP using sugar, right? That's a ready-made source, okay? So we have to make sure we have the right amount. So the point here is just to remind you about how we can do that. Do I expect you to memorize this? Oh no, but I want you to see. So when you have glucagon, what it's gonna do, it's gonna convert our glycogen into glucose. It can also allow you to form glucose in different ways, right? We can make it from amino acids and lactic acid, which is something that you build up. Lactic acid you build up when you do exercise, which is important because when you do exercise, you need more sugar. So it's really important that it can do that too. But this is the one that you absolutely should remember for this course. It's going to convert glycogen into glucose. Insulin is going to do the opposite, right? So you have high blood sugar. It's going to try and lower it by sticking sugar everywhere. So it's going to help sugar get into cells. It's going to convert glucose to glycogen so we can store it up. So these are the two I'd like you to remember. But it's also going to help increase the uptake of amino acids and stimulate protein synthesis because that needs a lot of energy. And it's going to help you make fat. It's going to slow down the processes of breaking sugar and glycogen. All right. So, but the main ones, accelerating the uptake of glucose into cells and making the glycogen. All right. Now, diabetes. We can't not talk about that. And diabetes, there's two different types. Type 1 is autoimmune. All right. So what's happening here is that the pancreas isn't producing enough insulin. And that's why people who have type 1 diabetes take insulin injections. And the reason, one of the reasons that they might not is because there's an autoimmune destruction of those beta cells. So they're just not making it. Type 2 diabetes, though, that's lifestyle. That is not insulin dependent. The people who have diabetes type 2, which is the one that we mostly hear about, that is often called insulin resistant diabetes because they make insulin. But the thing is, if you have so much of that sugar in your body just gets tired of listening. Really, it's not listening to the insulin anymore. So medication and lifestyle changes are the way to treat that. All right. Now, the last thing here, here's a couple of videos to watch. It sort of reviews some stuff. And I'm just highlighting that we'll go over the sex hormones in great detail, and a little bit about the kidney and as well, hormones, as we move further in the course. All right. Okay, so, and I apologize, my phone always rings when I do one of these videos. And I'm actually think that was somebody that wanted me to do a reference for one of my former students. And I feel that I should call them back. Anyways, thank you, and hopefully this has been helpful. And that should be it for today.